The sun had barely cleared the pines when they loosed the dogs. Chains slid from thick collars, and 3 dark bodies surged forward as one, low to the ground, noses cutting the morning air like blades. The men watched with grim satisfaction. By noon, they said, by dusk at the latest, no one outran those dogs, and no one escaped the land once it decided to keep you. The year was 1891, and the rules were old, written into soil and blood long before any of them were born. She had fled before the bells, barefoot and bleeding, leaving behind a room that still smelled of lamp oil and fear. They called her property, but she had learned the weight of words and how they could undo men if spoken in the right order. Whatever she carried into the woods with her was worth more than her life to them, and that was why the dogs were unleashed without prayer or pause. At first, everything went as expected. The dogs pulled hard, straining leather and muscle, their breath a steady rasp. The trail led through low brush, across a creek swollen with last night's rain, then into the deeper forest where the light thinned and the air grew cold. Hours passed. The men followed at a distance, rifles slung, confidence curdling slowly into unease. The dogs did not bark. They did not howl. They ran as if guided by something just beyond sight. By the 8th hour, the forest had changed. The birds were gone. Even the insects had fallen silent. When the men finally heard a sound, it was not the triumphant bay they expected, but a low, broken whine. They found the dogs standing together in a clearing, sides heaving, eyes wide and fixed on the trees. Their paws were caked with black mud that smelled of iron and rot. The trail ended there, as if the girl had stepped out of the world entirely, leaving behind only the knowledge that whatever had happened in those 8 hours was never meant to be found. She ran before the morning knew it had begun, slipping from the quarters while the lamps still burned low and the men slept heavy with drink and certainty. The night had pressed its fingerprints into her skin, cold and damp, and the hem of her dress was already torn where it had caught on a nail she did not remember seeing before. She did not look back, not even when the floorboard groaned beneath her last step, because looking back was how fear learned your face and memorized it. She had learned that lesson young. Fear always remembered. The estate lay quiet in that dangerous way that suggested it was only pretending to sleep. Buildings hunched in the dark like beasts at rest, their windows unblinking. Somewhere, a clock marked time for people who believed time belonged to them. She crossed the yard with her breath locked tight in her chest, counting each step, feeling the dirt cold and soft beneath her bare feet. Every sound felt loud enough to summon the world. The chirr of a cricket, the rustle of fabric, her own pulse, hammering so hard she feared it might call her name aloud. She carried nothing that could slow her. No bundle, no shoes, no keepsake. Everything she needed was already inside her head, and that was the most dangerous cargo of all. For months she had listened when they thought her deaf. She had watched when they thought her invisible. She had pieced together words spoken carelessly, numbers muttered over ledgers, names said once and never repeated. She knew who owed whom, who had taken what, and which hands were dirtier than the rest. Knowledge, she had learned, was heavier than chains if the wrong people realized you had it. The gate was unlatched. That alone told her the night was different. Someone had been careless, or someone had wanted it that way. She did not pause to wonder which. Beyond it, the land dipped and rose toward the tree line, a long stretch of open ground she had always feared. Crossing it felt like stepping onto a stage with no audience visible, but all of them watching. The sky was just beginning to thin, black fading into bruised blue, and she ran low, keeping her silhouette broken against the ground. Each step away from the house loosened something inside her, that had been clenched for years. Pain flared where her foot split on a stone, warm and sharp, but she welcomed it. Pain meant movement. Pain meant she was still here. She let the blood fall where it would, knowing later it might betray her, but there was no time for careful choices. Careful choices were a luxury she had never been given. At the edge of the forest, she slowed. The trees breathed differently than the open land, their air thick and old. She pressed her palm to the bark of the nearest trunk, grounding herself, feeling the roughness bite into her skin. The forest did not belong to the estate. That was the lie they told, but she had always known better. The forest listened only to itself. She stepped beneath its canopy, and the darkness folded around her like a held breath. Inside, the ground softened, swallowing the sound of her steps. She moved not straight, but slanted, doubling back, skirting streams where water would steal her scent and carry it elsewhere. These were tricks learned from watching men hunt animals for sport, laughing as if the act of pursuit made them holy. She used their knowledge against them now, turning it inward like a blade. Still, fear followed her, whispering of dogs with jaws like iron and men who believed the law bent to their will. As dawn threatened the horizon, she found a hollow between roots and crouched there, pulling leaves over her shoulders, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Images crowded her mind. The ledger, hidden behind a false wall. The mark burned into a crate that had crossed the river at night. The name of a man who smiled in church and killed in silence. She did not know if she would live long enough to speak these things aloud, but she knew this: if she stayed, she would never speak at all. When the first bird finally dared to sing, it sounded wrong, too thin, as if the world itself was unsure whether to continue. She waited, muscles aching, eyes burning, knowing that discovery was only a matter of time. They would wake. They would count. They would notice the absence where she had been and understand what absence meant. And when they did, they would not chase her because she was a girl, but because she was a threat, moving through their land with the power to unmake them, carrying the truth like a hidden flame, running not toward freedom, but toward whatever came next. Because anything was better than remaining where she was no longer supposed to be, where the night had finally released her and could not take her back again. Not now, not ever. Not while her heart still beat and the forest still held her breath and the knowledge inside her burned hot enough to light a path forward, even as the sun rose behind her and the distance between her and the estate stretched thin and fragile, and dangerously real. Her absence announced itself quietly, at first, like a skipped heartbeat. A cup left where it should not have been, a door not fully latched, the faint coolness in a room that should have held a sleeping body. It was the kind of wrongness only those accustomed to command ever noticed, because it disrupted routine rather than emotion. When the overseer stepped into the quarters and saw the empty space where she should have been, he did not shout. He stood still, listening, as if the walls themselves might explain what had been taken from him. Word traveled upward the way smoke finds a ceiling. The master was told while breaking his fast. Silver spoon paused midair, jaw tightening just enough to show the thought had landed. He asked no questions at first. He did not need to. A girl did not simply vanish from land like this. Not without help, not without intention. He set the spoon down carefully, more carefully than necessary, and that was when the household felt it. The subtle shift, the tightening of air that meant something had gone wrong enough to matter. By mid-morning, whispers threaded through the estate, quick and sharp. Servants avoided one another's eyes. No one knew who might be blamed for noticing too late or knowing too much. Some remembered seeing her near the storage rooms days before, lingering where she had no business. Others recalled her silence, how she listened more than she spoke. Small details, once meaningless, now rearranged themselves into suspicion. The men who managed the books exchanged glances that lingered a second too long. Numbers written in ink suddenly felt less permanent than they had the night before. In the main house, doors closed. Conversations lowered. Names were spoken only once, then swallowed. The master's brother arrived unexpectedly, his presence a reminder that power was shared, not owned, and that shared power bred resentment as easily as it bred loyalty. Old disagreements, long buried under profit and politeness, surfaced like bones after rain. If the girl had run, it meant she had heard something. If she had heard something, it meant someone had spoken when they should not have. Each man began to measure the others not by trust, but by risk. The overseer swore she knew nothing. He said it loudly, too loudly, as if volume could seal a truth. But there were ledgers missing from the shelf where they were usually kept. Their absence, disguised poorly by the books, leaned too neatly beside them. Someone remembered her cleaning that room more often than necessary. Someone else remembered correcting her once for lingering near the desk. These memories sharpened with each retelling, edges honed by fear, until they cut in only one direction. Outside, the field hands sensed the change without being told. Orders came quicker, harsher. Eyes watched them with new suspicion. The disappearance became a warning spoken without words. No one asked where she had gone, because the answer would have required admitting that escape was possible. Possibility was dangerous. It spread. It loosened the hold of certainty that kept everything in place. The men understood this instinctively. That was why they reacted not with panic, but with control, tightening their grip as if the land itself might slip away. By noon, the master had decided she was not just gone, but stolen. Taken by her own will, yes, but also by the failure of others to keep her contained. Responsibility became a currency traded carefully. Blame hovered, unclaimed. Each man began quietly calculating how much the girl might know, and how quickly that knowledge could travel if it found the wrong ears. The thought of her speaking freely, unguarded by fear, unsettled them more than the loss of labor ever could. They searched her sleeping space last. It was sparse, but even sparseness told a story when examined closely. The thin mattress had been lifted, a loose board discovered. Behind it, dust disturbed, a hollow where something had been hidden and taken. Whatever it was, it had not been a luxury. It had been a purpose. The master stared at the space longer than necessary, his mind filling it with worst possibilities. He said nothing, but his silence carried an order. By the time the dogs were mentioned, the decision felt inevitable. Yet even then, hesitation crept in. Dogs meant certainty. Dogs meant the trail would not lie. And certainty was a double-edged thing. If the trail led somewhere it should not, if it crossed boundaries better left unacknowledged, there would be no unseeing it. Old rivalries pressed close in that moment. One man suggested waiting until morning fully broke. Another argued for speed. Beneath the practical words, something more corrosive moved, fear that the girl's absence had already done its damage. When the collars were fetched, hands trembled. Not from cold, but from the understanding that once the dogs were released, the search would reveal more than a location. It would reveal cracks already present, fault lines running through the estate long before the girl ever ran. Her escape had not created those divisions. It had merely exposed them, pulling hidden tensions into the open, forcing men who had long profited from silence to confront the possibility that silence no longer protected them. That somewhere beyond the trees a single girl carried enough truth to turn their whispered sins into something that could not be locked away again. The decision, once spoken aloud, settled over the yard with a weight no one could pretend not to feel. Dogs were not brought out for spectacle. They were brought out when a matter had crossed the line from inconvenience into threat. The kennels sat at the far edge of the property, downwind and half, hidden by a stand of cypress, as if even the land understood they were meant to be kept apart from ordinary life. When the gate creaked open, the sound traveled farther than expected, cutting through the morning like a warning. 3 Rottweilers emerged, massive and deliberate, their dark coats already catching the heat of the rising sun. They did not bark at first. They did not need to. Their presence alone rearranged the air, drawing the eyes of every man nearby despite themselves. These were not animals raised for companionship. They were trained for certainty, shaped from the start to follow one thing, and one thing only once it had been given to them. Failure was not a concept they recognized, because it had never been allowed. The handler approached them with practiced calm, though his jaw was set tight. He had worked these dogs since they were young, teaching them the difference between command and chaos. Each had a name, but he did not use it now. Names softened edges, and there was no room for softness. He checked collars, ran his fingers along thick leather and metal studs, ensuring nothing would give when the dogs pulled. Their muscles shifted beneath his hands, coiled and ready, eyes fixed not on him but on the open yard beyond, where the scent waited. A scrap of cloth was brought out, torn from the girl's dress and held carefully, as if it might burn. The handler knelt, letting each dog catch the scent in turn. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Heads lowered, bodies angled forward, breath slowed, deepened. The world narrowed to a single thread only they could see. Whatever thoughts the men had been clinging to were stripped away in that moment, replaced by the brutal simplicity of pursuit. The men gathered at a distance, forming a loose semicircle. Some crossed their arms. Others rested hands on rifle stocks, though they knew weapons would be useless until the dogs finished their work. No one spoke. The silence was not respectful, it was cautious. There was a sense, unspoken but shared, that once the dogs moved, events would no longer be fully in human hands. The master watched with a face carved into stillness, his eyes flicking briefly to his brother, then away again. When the chains were unfastened, the sound rang louder than expected, metal kissing metal before falling away. For a breath, nothing happened. The dogs stood frozen, as if measuring the world. Then, as one, they surged forward. Dirt scattered beneath their paws. The handler let the lead slip through his hands, stepping back quickly to avoid being pulled off balance. The dogs did not look back. They never did. They crossed the yard at a relentless pace, noses low, bodies aligned in a way that spoke of shared purpose. Where the girl's blood had fallen, they slowed, fanning slightly, recalibrating. One circled once, twice, then locked on and pulled hard toward the open ground. The others followed without hesitation. The trail was clear to them, even if it remained invisible to everyone else. The men followed at a distance, boots thudding, trying to match a rhythm that was never meant for human legs. As the dogs reached the gate, there was a brief hesitation, so subtle it might have been imagined. The handler noticed it and frowned. Dogs did not pause without reason. But the moment passed, and they pressed on, pulling into the open land beyond. The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the last of the morning's mist. Heat rose from the earth, carrying scents in complicated currents, yet the dogs did not falter. Their confidence was absolute, and that absoluteness unsettled the men more than doubt ever could. With every step away from the house, the estate's sense of control thinned. Familiar landmarks fell behind them. The dogs led them toward the forest, where the trees thickened and the ground darkened with shadow. Conversation remained absent, but thoughts grew loud. Each man imagined a different ending, none of them good. The dogs were meant to retrieve, to return what had been taken. Yet there was an awareness creeping in, like an itch beneath the skin, that retrieval was not the only possible outcome. By the time the dogs disappeared beneath the canopy, the men understood something irreversible had been set in motion. Releasing the Rottweilers had been an assertion of dominance, a declaration that nothing escaped their reach. But as the forest swallowed the dogs and the trail pulled deeper into places rarely entered, that declaration began to feel less like a promise and more like a challenge issued to forces they did not fully understand. Forces that did not answer to collars or commands. Forces that had been waiting, patient and silent, long before the chains were ever unclasped. And the hunt began in earnest with the heavy certainty that whatever lay ahead would not end cleanly or quietly, because it never did when men believed control was the same as power. At first the dogs ran true, their bodies aligned with the kind of confidence bred through years of successful hunts. The handler watched their movements closely, reading them the way another man might read a map, and what he saw unsettled him in ways he could not immediately name. The lead dog slowed, nose sweeping wide arcs across the forest floor, then corrected sharply to the left, only to veer back again moments later. It was not confusion, exactly. It was deliberation, as if the scent itself were shifting beneath their feet. They followed a narrow path where the undergrowth had been pressed down recently, leaves bruised and darkened by passage. The dogs surged forward, then abruptly doubled back, pulling hard enough that the handler nearly lost his footing. He cursed under his breath, glancing at the men behind him, but said nothing. Dogs lost trails all the time when water or wind interfered, but this was different. The scent did not fade. It tangled. It bent in on itself like a coiled rope. They reached a stream no wider than a wagon track, its surface broken by stones slick with moss. The dogs plunged through without hesitation, water spraying as they climbed the opposite bank, only to slow again, circling tightly, paws churning mud into thick paste. One dog whined softly, low in its throat, a sound none of the men had heard from it before. The handler felt a prickle run up his spine. A whine meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was not something these dogs were taught to voice. Beyond the stream, the forest grew denser, branches knitting overhead until the light thinned to a dull green haze. Here, the trail twisted unnaturally. The dogs traced a path that looped back toward the stream, then cut sharply uphill, then curved again, as if the girl had walked in deliberate circles. The men exchanged glances now, their earlier confidence giving way to irritation. No one ran like this, unless they were being hunted by something worse than dogs, or unless they wanted to be followed somewhere specific. The handler knelt and pressed his hand to the ground, as though that might tell him something the dogs had not already made clear. The scent was strong, almost overwhelming, but it layered over itself again and again, as if time itself had folded in this place. He stood and tugged gently on the leads, attempting to guide the dogs forward, but they resisted, pulling in different directions, each convinced of its own truth. This should not have been possible. These dogs were trained to move as one. They advanced deeper, and the forest began to feel wrong. Trees leaned at odd angles, roots breaking the surface like grasping fingers. The air carried a damp, metallic smell that clung to the back of the throat. Birds did not scatter as they approached. There was no startled movement, no sudden flight. It was as if the woods had already absorbed their presence and decided not to react. The dog's pace slowed, their earlier power tempered by something closer to caution. Again, the trail doubled back, leading them within sight of their own footprints. One of the men laughed sharply, the sound brittle and forced, but no one joined him. The idea that the girl had outwitted them so thoroughly began to take hold, and with it came an uncomfortable respect. She had not fled blindly. She had moved with intention, using the forest as an ally rather than an obstacle. Each loop felt less like panic and more like strategy. The handler's confidence eroded with every mile. He had seen dogs missiled by water, by other animals, by deliberate attempts to confuse a trail, but never like this. The scent behaved as if it were alive, retreating just as they closed in, reappearing where it should have been gone. The dogs growled softly now, not at any visible threat, but at the ground itself, hackles lifting in a way that signaled frustration edged with fear. They reached a clearing that should not have existed, a round open space where the trees stood back as if in deference. The dogs halted at its edge, refusing to cross. No command would move them forward. They circled the perimeter instead, tracing the boundary again and again, noses pressed low, breaths coming fast. The scent pooled here, thick and unmistakable, then vanished as if swallowed whole. It did not trail away. It ended. The men stepped into the clearing reluctantly, feeling exposed beneath the open sky. The handler tried once more to urge the dogs forward, his voice sharp with authority, but the animals braced themselves, muscles locked, eyes fixed on the far tree line. One sat down abruptly, an act of refusal so rare it stunned him into silence. These dogs did not sit when they were working. They advanced or they fought. In that moment, an unspoken realization settled over the group. The trail had not been lost by accident. It had been turned back on itself, folded and guided into confusion by a series of choices too precise to dismiss as luck. Whether by instinct, desperation, or some deeper understanding of the land, the girl had done more than flee. She had unsettled the rules of pursuit itself, bending them until even the dogs, creatures shaped to follow certainty, could no longer tell which direction led forward, and which led only back into the waiting dark of the forest where paths, repeated and meaning, slipped loose from its familiar shape, and the hunt began to feel less like a chase and more like a slow, deliberate invitation into something that had already decided how the story would continue. The sky shifted without warning, as if the forest itself had summoned the change. What had been a pale, watchful light dimmed to a bruised gray, clouds rolling in low and fast, smothering the sun before anyone could mark the hour. The air thickened, pressing against skin and lungs, heavy with the promise of rain. One of the men muttered a curse, glancing upward, calculating how quickly weather could undo even the best laid hunt. The handler felt it too, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the coming storm. The first drops fell wide and slow, darkening the soil in scattered marks. The dogs reacted immediately, noses lifting, bodies tensing. Rain was an enemy to scent, washing away the delicate traces that guided them forward. But still they strained against their leads, desperate to follow what remained. Then the sky opened fully. Water crashed down through the canopy, leaves shuddering under its weight, branches snapping and shedding torrents that turned the forest floor slick and treacherous. Within minutes, footprints vanished. Mud swallowed impressions as fast as they were made. Blood, sweat, crushed leaves. All the small betrayals that normally marked a human passage dissolved into brown slurry. The men cursed openly now, struggling to keep pace as the ground shifted beneath their boots. Rifles were slung tighter. Hats were pulled low, but the rain found every seam, soaking through wool and leather alike. The forest smelled sharp and raw, like something freshly wounded. The dogs pushed on, driven by instinct rather than certainty. Their earlier confidence fractured into urgency, then into something closer to desperation. They pulled hard toward a fallen log, then skidded sideways as water surged down a shallow gully that had not existed an hour before. The handler slipped, catching himself just in time, his heart hammering as he imagined losing control of the leads. If the dogs broke free now, there would be no retrieving them. They would vanish into the storm, chasing a scent that might no longer be there. Thunder rolled overhead, deep and prolonged, vibrating through bone. The sound unsettled the men, but it rattled the dogs in a way none of them had seen before. One flinched, ears flattening briefly, then surged forward again as if ashamed of the hesitation. Rain plastered their coats to their bodies, dark fur slick and shining, muscles working beneath like coiled machinery pushed past its limits. The handler's eyes never left the dogs, searching for signs. He saw it then, the subtle change he had been dreading. Their movements grew erratic. Where before they had pulled in unison, now they tugged at angles, correcting and overcorrecting, noses sweeping wider arcs as the scent thinned and smeared. The rain was winning, stripping the forest clean of memory. Each drop was a small erasure, and together they formed a flood. The men slowed despite themselves. The storm demanded attention. Trees creaked and swayed, their roots groaning as water loosened the soil. A branch crashed down somewhere nearby, splitting the air with a sound like a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. The thought crept in uninvited and unwelcome. The forest was no longer just terrain. It had become an active participant, reshaping itself in ways that did not favor pursuit. They reached another stream, now swollen into a rushing ribbon of brown water. The dogs lunged toward it, then balked, pacing along the bank, searching for a place to cross. Rain hammered the surface, breaking reflections, confusing even their sharp senses. The handler shouted encouragement, his voice nearly lost in the downpour, but the dogs hesitated, paws skidding on wet stones. When they finally crossed, the scent on the far side was thin, scattered, no longer a clear line, but a constellation of maybes. One of the men suggested turning back, waiting out the storm. The idea was dismissed immediately, but it lingered, heavy and tempting. The rain had leveled the field, stripping away the advantages they relied on. It did not matter how skilled the dogs were if the world itself refused to hold onto the past. Time collapsed under the weight of water, leaving only the present moment and the uncertainty pressing in from all sides. The dogs pressed forward again, but something fundamental had changed. They were no longer following a trail so much as searching for reassurance that the trail had ever truly existed. Their breathing grew harsher, tinged with stress. They shook their heads repeatedly, flinging water from their ears, then lowered their noses again with stubborn resolve. Each step felt like an argument against the storm, and the storm answered by erasing whatever they thought they had found. As the rain intensified, sound became distorted. Footsteps were swallowed, voices blurred. Direction lost meaning beneath the uniform drumming. The men felt smaller, less certain of their place, as if the forest had expanded while they shrank within it. The idea that the girl might be out here too, exposed to the same elements, should have stirred urgency. Instead, it stirred something closer to dread. If she had survived this long, if she had moved through this land while the sky itself turned against pursuit, then she was no longer just fleeing. She was enduring. When the storm showed no sign of breaking, the handler finally understood what had been stolen from them. Not the trail alone, but time. The rain had collapsed hours into a single, relentless now, smearing cause and effect together until the hunt felt suspended in a gray limbo where progress was impossible to measure. The dogs continued forward out of instinct, driven by the need to resolve what had been begun. But the world no longer offered clear answers. Only soaked earth, blurred scents, and the unsettling realization that whatever chance they had of clean pursuit had been washed away entirely, leaving them to follow not footprints, but fragments of intent scattered and hidden beneath the storm as it raged on, without concern for men or animals, or the fragile illusion that the past could always be traced if one simply tried hard enough. Time stretched thin and strange after the storm, as if the hours no longer agreed to move in a straight line. The men stopped checking the sun, because it told them nothing useful anymore, hidden behind a ceiling of gray that refused to lift. 8 hours passed not with markers, but with absence. No barking cut through the trees, no signal came from ahead. The forest swallowed sound so completely that even their own movements felt like intrusions that might provoke retaliation if they were not careful. The dogs had gone on ahead when the handler finally released the leads, trusting their instinct to reestablish what the rain had stolen. At first, the men had welcomed the distance, believing silence meant speed, that the dogs were closing in too fast to waste breath on noise. But silence has a way of changing its meaning. As minutes piled onto minutes, and then onto hours, it became oppressive, heavy enough to bend thought. Dogs always barked when they cornered something. Dogs always barked when they lost the trail entirely. This was neither. They waited at intervals, calling out sharp commands that should have carried. Each time, their voices fell flat, absorbed by wet bark and thick moss, returning nothing but a dull echo that sounded wrong in their own ears. The handler felt sweat cooling beneath his clothes despite the damp air, his mind running through possibilities he did not like. Injury. A broken leg from a hidden ravine. A fallen tree pinning one of the animals beneath its weight. Even those explanations felt inadequate. Injured dogs cried out. Trapped dogs fought the silence with sound. The men spread out slightly, careful not to lose sight of one another. Their formation loose but deliberate. Rifles were kept ready, not because they expected to shoot, but because holding them steadied the hands. Every so often, someone stopped abruptly, convinced they had heard something. Breathing, movement, a low growl. But each time it proved to be nothing more than water dripping from leaves or wind worrying at branches. The forest seemed to be listening, holding itself unnaturally still, as if sound were a currency it had decided not to spend. As the 8th hour approached, fear began to shift shape. It was no longer sharp or frantic, but dull and creeping, the kind that settled into joints and made every step feel heavier than the last. The men stopped speaking altogether. Even whispered words felt dangerous now, as though naming the silence might anger it. The handler's thoughts circled the same realization again and again. He had never known these dogs to go quiet for this long, not even when exhausted, not even when confused. Silence was not in their nature. They came upon signs that should have brought relief, but instead deepened unease. Broken branches snapped clean rather than torn. Mud smeared with broad paw prints that abruptly ended. Scratches on bark too high to be made by an animal merely passing through. The marks suggested effort, struggle, but no direction. It was as if the dogs had reached a moment that demanded action, and then nothing further had been allowed to follow. One man crossed himself without realizing he was doing it. Another laughed softly, the sound brittle and short, stopping almost as soon as it began. No one commented. The idea that the dogs might have found the girl and finished their work was raised silently and dismissed just as quickly. There would have been noise. There would have been signs. This absence was something else entirely, something unresolved. The handler finally halted them all with a raised hand. He crouched, pressing his ear close to the ground, feeling foolish even as he did it. The earth offered no answers. He stood slowly, his face tight, eyes scanning the trees as if expecting them to rearrange themselves into something recognizable. In his chest, a new certainty formed, unwelcome and stubborn. Whatever had happened to the dogs, it had not been quick. The forest grew darker, though the day should have been advancing. Shadows thickened between trunks, pooling in ways that made distance hard to judge. The men felt watched, not in the sharp way of being hunted, but in the patient way of being observed. It was the kind of attention that did not rush, that did not need to. The silence stretched, unbroken, until it felt deliberate, a statement rather than an absence. By the time they admitted to themselves that 8 hours had passed, the silence had become the loudest thing any of them had ever known, pressing in on their thoughts, forcing them to confront the possibility that the dogs had not failed in their task but had reached a point where sound itself no longer served a purpose, where barking would have been meaningless or dangerous, or simply unnecessary. And in that realization the men understood that whatever lay ahead was no longer bound by the familiar rules of pursuit or dominance or control, that the forest had accepted the dogs into its deeper order, and had not yet decided whether to return them, leaving the searchers suspended in a waiting that felt less like delay and more like judgment, hanging heavy in the air as the silence continued unbroken and absolute. Watching them, in return they found the dogs. Just as the light began to thin, that uneasy hour when the forest could not decide whether to hold on to day or surrender to night. It was one of the younger men who saw them first. Shapes crouched low near a stand of alder, and his shout came out strangled, as if even relief had to fight its way free. The others hurried forward, boots slipping in mud, hearts lifting and sinking at the same time as the forms resolved into something unmistakably alive and unmistakably wrong. All 3 Rottweilers were together, pressed close enough that their flanks touched, a tight knot of muscle and fur where usually they would have been spread, dominant, and sure. Their coats were matted with thick, blackened mud that clung in heavy plaits, drying stiff in places, wet in others, carrying a smell that turned the stomach. It was not the clean, mineral scent of rain-soaked earth, but something fouler, iron, laced and sour, like soil that had been disturbed too deeply and too long. The handler dropped to his knees without thinking, calling out in the sharp, familiar cadence. The dogs had always answered, but none of them looked at him. Their eyes were wide, whites showing, fixed not on the men but on the trees beyond, tracking something no one else could see. One dog trembled visibly, a shudder running through its shoulders that it did not attempt to control. Another had its tail tucked so tight it seemed pinned in place, breath coming in short, shallow pulls that rasped faintly. These were not the bodies of animals that had merely run hard or lost a trail. This was fear, naked and unashamed. The handler reached out slowly, murmuring reassurance, his voice rough with disbelief. When his hand brushed the nearest collar, the dog flinched violently, twisting away with a sharp, broken sound that might have been a whine or might have been something else entirely. The man froze, stunned. These dogs had been struck, injured, exhausted before, and never once had they recoiled from his touch. The bond between them had been forged in discipline and reward, in certainty. Now that certainty lay shattered at his feet. They examined the dogs as best they could. There were no obvious wounds, no blood beyond scrapes that could be explained by hard running through brush. Yet the mud on their legs was thickest at the paws, packed so tightly between pads it had to be pried loose, and beneath it the skin was raw and tender, as if they had stood in something corrosive or had been forced to brace themselves for hours without moving. Their tongues lolled, but not from simple exhaustion. It was the slack, uneasy posture of animals whose bodies had survived something their minds were still trapped inside. Commands were attempted again, firmer this time. Sit, stand, heel. The words fell into the space between men and dogs and died there. One dog managed to rise unsteadily, then sank back down almost immediately, gaze never leaving the tree line. Another began to shake its head repeatedly, as though trying to dislodge a sound only it could hear. The third let out a low growl that rumbled from deep in its chest, not aimed at anyone present, but vibrating toward the woods like a warning offered too late. The men exchanged looks that needed no translation. Dogs that refused command were more unsettling than dogs that attacked. Obedience had always been the measure of control, the proof that even instinct could be bent to human will. Here, obedience had dissolved, leaving behind creatures stripped to something more honest and far more disturbing. Whatever they had encountered had not overpowered them by force. It had undone them in another way. The handler finally managed to slip a lead back onto one collar, then another, working with careful patience, avoiding sudden movements. Each click of metal made the dogs tense, muscles bunching as if expecting pain. When he gently tugged, they resisted at first, then rose together, moving only because they were pulled, not because they chose to. Their steps were hesitant, uneven, as though the ground itself could not be trusted to hold. As they began the slow return toward the clearing, the dogs balked repeatedly, planting their feet and leaning away from certain directions. Once, when a man stepped too close to a particular tree, all three animals reacted at once, snarling sharply, teeth bared, eyes blazing with something close to panic. The man stumbled back pale, hands raised, and no one mocked him for it. The message was clear enough. There were places the dogs would not go again. Questions tumbled through the men's minds, unspoken but relentless. Had the dogs found the girl? Had they lost her? Had something else found them first? The handler replayed the hunt in his head, searching for the moment it had gone wrong, the point where instinct had ceased to guide and had instead warned. He could find none. The trail had not ended in failure. It had ended in refusal. As darkness crept closer, the forest seemed to exhale, sound returning in cautious fragments. A distant bird call, the whisper of leaves shifting. Through it all, the dogs remained rigidly alert, heads turning in unison at movements too small or too distant for human senses. They did not relax even as they were led away from the place they had been found. If anything, their tension sharpened, as if leaving felt more dangerous than staying. By the time the men fully grasped what they were seeing, a new understanding settled in, cold and unwelcome. The dogs were alive, yes, but whatever had shaped them into fearless hunters had been altered. They had been returned, but not restored, and the way they shook, the way they refused to meet familiar eyes, the way they clung together as if separation itself were unbearable, all spoke of an encounter that had not merely delayed the hunt, but had rewritten it, turning predators into witnesses and leaving behind the unnerving certainty that the girl had not been chased into exhaustion or torn apart in the woods, but had passed through a moment so decisive that even creatures bred for dominance had emerged changed, carrying fear in their bodies like a contagion that could spread, waiting to be understood, waiting to be named, while the forest watched in silence, and the men realized that whatever had protected her had done so without leaving a mark that could be followed back again. The handler tried to reconstruct the trail once more, driven by habit and the refusal to accept an ending that made no sense. He led the dogs back toward the place where they had been found, watching their bodies tense with every step. The closer they drew, the more resistant the animals became, feet dragging, muscles locking, a collective refusal so strong it felt like pushing against a wall. When they reached the edge of the clearing, the dogs stopped entirely, bracing themselves low to the ground, chests heaving, eyes fixed ahead with a terror that did not flicker or fade. The clearing itself looked ordinary at first glance, almost disappointingly so. A circular stretch of ground where the trees stood back, their trunks evenly spaced, their branches arcing inward as if in quiet agreement. The soil was dark and churned, but not in the chaotic way of a struggle. It was flattened in places, smoothed in others, as though something heavy had rested there for a long time. The handler crouched and pressed his palm to the earth. It was cold, colder than the surrounding forest, and faintly damp despite the hours since the storm had passed. They searched the perimeter carefully. No footprints led away. No broken branches marked an exit. The scent the dogs had followed pooled thickly here, and then vanished, not fading gradually, but stopping all at once, as if cut clean with a blade. One man walked the circle again and again, widening his search with each pass, growing more frustrated as nothing changed. Trails ended because something moved on or something was carried away. They did not simply stop. A map was brought out, creased and smudged from use, and spread across a fallen log. The men bent over it, fingers tracing familiar landmarks, streams and ridges they had known their whole lives. The clearing did not exist on the map. There was no marking for open ground in this part of the forest, no note of a meadow or break in the trees. According to the lines and symbols, they should have been standing in dense growth, hemmed in on all sides. The absence felt deliberate, as if the land itself had chosen not to be recorded. One of the older men muttered that maps were only as good as the men who made them. Another snapped back that this land had been surveyed twice, walked and measured, every acre accounted for. The argument fizzled quickly, dying under the weight of what lay before them. Surveyors did not miss clearings like this. They did not overlook perfect circles in the middle of nowhere. The handler folded the map slowly, hands shaking despite his effort to remain steady. They searched for signs of recent digging, for disturbed roots or displaced stones, but found nothing consistent. The ground was compacted, yes, but not torn. It suggested pressure rather than violence, weight rather than struggle. Someone suggested the girl might have climbed a tree, but there were no scuffed trunks, no broken branches above. The dogs growled low at the suggestion, a collective sound that shut down further speculation. As dusk deepened, the clearing seemed to change subtly, shadows stretching in ways that made its shape harder to define. What had been a neat circle blurred at the edges, the boundary between open ground and forest less certain. The men stepped closer together without comment, an unconscious response to the sense that distance was becoming unreliable. The handler realized with a jolt that he could no longer tell how far they stood from the tree line, though he had measured it earlier with his own steps. The dogs refused to cross the threshold again. When coaxed forward, they leaned back hard enough to strain their collars, nails scraping softly against the earth. Their fear was not explosive but absolute, a settled conviction that whatever lay at the center of the clearing was not meant to be approached. The handler had always trusted their instincts more than his own. Now, that trust twisted into something colder, heavier. They marked the location as best they could, tying strips of cloth to nearby branches, stacking stones in careful patterns meant to guide them back. Yet even as they worked, doubt gnawed at them. There was an unspoken fear that the markers would not hold, that the forest would rearrange itself once they turned away. The idea was irrational, and yet no one laughed when it surfaced in a halting whisper. As the light finally failed, The decision was made to leave. Staying felt dangerous in a way that defied explanation, like lingering too long at the edge of a deep well. The men gathered their things, casting final, uneasy glances at the clearing as if expecting it to react to their departure. It did not. It simply waited, silent and unmarked by any sign of struggle or escape, holding the end of the trail in its cold, empty center. On the walk back, the handler could not shake the feeling that the clearing had not swallowed the girl, nor hidden her, but had served as a threshold of some kind, a place where pursuit ceased to function and intention lost its grip. The dogs moved faster the farther they got from it, their steps growing surer, though they never fully relaxed. When the clearing finally vanished behind the trees, a collective breath seemed to release, but no one spoke of relief. Later, when they tried to explain the hunt to those waiting at the estate, words failed them. How did one describe a place that erased direction, that existed without permission from paper or memory? How did one admit that the most fearsome tools they possessed had been rendered useless by a stretch of ground that refused to be understood? The map was unfolded again, studied under lamplight, but the blankness remained, a silent accusation that not everything could be claimed, charted, or owned, that somewhere between the lines and symbols there were spaces that belonged to something else entirely, spaces that opened when needed and closed behind those who passed through, leaving only confusion and the echo of certainty undone, where the trail should have continued, but did not, and could not, and would never again be followed beyond that place that should not have existed on any map. The evidence did not announce itself all at once. It surfaced in fragments, small contradictions that refused to fit the story the men expected to tell. At first, they dismissed these details as exhaustion, as imagination sharpened by fear. But the more they returned to the hunt in their minds, the more a different shape began to emerge, one that made them uneasy, not because it was violent, but because it was deliberate. The dog's condition was the first and clearest sign. They had not been injured in the way animals were injured when they attacked or were attacked. There were no torn ears, no bite wounds, no blood matted into their fur beyond superficial scrapes. Their fear did not smell of pain. It smelled of restraint, of being held at a boundary they could not cross. The handler had seen dogs break bones to reach a target. He had seen them fight boars and men alike. What he had never seen was fear that came from being stopped without force. Then, there was the clearing. The ground there bore weight, not chaos. It showed no sign of pursuit collapsing into violence. No drag marks. No blood. No scattering that suggested panic. If the girl had been caught there, the place would have told the story. Earth always did. Instead, the clearing felt settled, as though something had arrived, paused, and departed without urgency. The trail did not explode into endings. It resolved. As the men spoke in low voices that night, another detail surfaced, one that had been overlooked in the tension of the search. The scent itself. The handler struggled to explain it, lacking the language to describe something so instinctual. But he tried. The dogs had not followed a diminishing trail, nor one masked by clever tricks alone. The scent had been guided. It had been allowed to lead them until a certain point, then denied further passage. That was not the behavior of prey trying only to escape. It was the behavior of a presence deciding how close the hunters were permitted to come. Someone mentioned the storm again, arguing that rain explained everything. The handler shook his head. Rain erased trails. It did not gather them. It did not pull scent into one place and hold it there. The storm had helped, yes, but it had not acted alone. The rain had been an accomplice, not the architect. More unsettling still was the realization that the girl's path showed no signs of collapse. No place where she had fallen, no marks of hesitation, no evidence of confusion or wandering once she entered the deeper forest. Even her loops and doubled tracks did not feel desperate in retrospect. They felt measured, as though she had known exactly how long to confuse pursuit and when to stop running altogether. The idea that she had not been alone in that knowledge unsettled them deeply. The men searched for signs of another human presence and found none, which only sharpened the unease. There were no extra footprints, no camps, no broken brush that suggested help in the conventional sense. Whatever had intervened had not left the kind of evidence they knew how to read. And yet, intervention was the only explanation that fit all the facts. The dogs had not failed. They had been turned back. The hunt had not ended in loss. It had ended in refusal. One of the older men, quiet until now, finally spoke what the others had been circling. He said the girl had not been protected by strength greater than theirs, but by something older, something that did not need to overpower to be obeyed. The forest, he suggested, did not always behave as empty land. Sometimes it chose. Sometimes it remembered. His words were met with silence, not ridicule. No one was in the mood to argue metaphysics, but no one could deny that the hunt had crossed into territory where ownership no longer applied. Even the girl herself began to appear differently in their thoughts. Not as a frightened figure fleeing blindly, but as someone who had crossed a line they did not understand and been received rather than punished. She had not been hidden like stolen property. She had been passed through, removed from reach without violence, as if the land itself had judged the pursuit unnecessary. That thought struck deeper than any fear of dogs or storms. It implied a moral weight they had never acknowledged, let alone answered. By morning, the dogs would not stop staring toward the forest's edge, but there was no longer frenzy in them. Only vigilance, as though they knew the girl was no longer within the realm of chasing at all. Whatever had happened, it had not been a narrow escape measured in distance and time. It had been a crossing, a transition from one order into another. The men sensed this without fully admitting it, the way one senses the presence of something sacred or forbidden without daring to name it. When they considered sending another party, the idea faltered quickly. Not because they feared danger in the ordinary sense, but because they sensed futility. The hunt had reached a conclusion that did not involve capture or death, and any attempt to restart it would mean denying the evidence before them. The dogs of fear. The silent clearing. The way the trail had ended not in chaos, but in calm. In the end, the most terrifying realization was also the quietest. The girl had not won by outrunning them or by hiding better than they could search. She had been spared, shielded, chosen, and whatever had chosen her had done so without noise, without struggle, without leaving behind anything the men could seize or punish, leaving them only with the knowledge that their power had limits they had never imagined, and that somewhere beyond the mapped land and the reach of commands and chains, the girl continued on her path, not as a fugitive, but as someone who had been allowed to go, protected not by mercy as they understood it, but by something that had simply decided she would not be taken, not then, not there, not by them. Ever the realization did not arrive as a sudden thought, but as a gradual inversion, a quiet turning of perspective that made everything they had done feel exposed. It began with the smallest things. A pause before stepping forward. The sense that choosing a path was no longer neutral. A man dropped his glove and hesitated before bending to retrieve it, aware for no clear reason that the act itself might be noticed. The forest had resumed its sounds, but those sounds now felt arranged, deliberate, as if silence had been withdrawn not in surrender but in confidence. On the walk back to the estate, the men found themselves looking over their shoulders, not sharply, not with panic, but with the wary awareness of being observed. No branches snapped, no figures moved between the trees. Yet the sensation persisted, subtle and unshakable, like standing in a room where someone else breathed just out of sight. The handler felt it most acutely. His life had been built on reading animals, on understanding pursuit and dominance, and now those instincts betrayed him. Nothing in his experience accounted for this reversal, this sense that the hunt had continued but changed direction. They spoke little, but when they did, their words circled around the same unease. The dogs walked close now, not pulling ahead, not lagging behind, glancing often toward the forest, with a watchfulness that mirrored the men's own. At one point, all 3 dogs stopped at once and stared into the trees, ears forward, bodies rigid. The men followed their gaze and saw nothing. After a long moment, the dogs moved on, but the feeling lingered, heavy as a held breath. As they neared the outer fields, the handler realized something that made his mouth go dry. He could no longer feel the girl's absence as a loss they were meant to correct. Instead, it felt like a boundary that had been drawn and noticed. The estate, the land, the authority they assumed stretched without resistance. All of it felt smaller now, enclosed within something larger that had allowed them to move only so far. The thought unsettled him more than any imagined threat. It suggested a hierarchy he had never considered himself subject to. Back at the house, explanations were demanded, voices rising, impatience flaring. The men spoke of storms, of confusion, of the dog's strange behavior, but the words rang hollow even as they were spoken. No one mentioned the sensation of being watched. Some things could not be said aloud without giving them too much shape. Yet it showed in posture, in the way men stood nearer to walls, in how windows were checked twice before night fully fell. That evening, as lamps were lit and the dogs lay restless near the kennels, the handler stepped outside alone. He did not know why. He only knew that staying inside felt wrong. The forest lay dark beyond the fields, a solid presence rather than an absence. He stared at it, half expecting some sign, some acknowledgement. None came, and yet the stillness felt complete, as if the forest did not need to announce itself to be aware of him. The idea took hold then, quiet but relentless. They had assumed the girl was fleeing something behind her. They had never considered that she might be moving toward something that had already seen her coming. The clearing, the dog's refusal, the way the trail had ended without violence. All of it rearranged itself into a different pattern. The forest had not reacted to the hunt. It had anticipated it, and in doing so, it had observed them as closely as they had observed the ground. Sleep came poorly that night. Dreams were shallow and fractured, filled with the sense of standing at the edge of something vast and patient. Men woke with the feeling of eyes on them, though nothing had moved. Even the dogs whimpered softly in their sleep, legs twitching, breath hitching as if reliving the moment they had been turned back. By morning, the decision not to pursue further had settled without formal agreement. No orders were given. None were needed. In the days that followed, small changes accumulated. Paths near the forest were avoided. Work was redirected. The men found reasons to stay closer to the house, to familiar ground. The idea of the girl resurfaced often, but not as an object of anger. She became something else in their minds, a figure associated with a line that could not be crossed. Her escape was no longer framed as defiance, but as departure, as though she had stepped into a different jurisdiction. Altogether, the most unsettling part was the lingering sense that the conclusion had not closed the matter. It had only shifted the balance of attention. The men understood, without ever saying so, that they had been measured and found wanting, not by force, but by awareness. The forest had watched them decide, watched them pursue, watched them stop. And in that watching, it had claimed the final word, long after the trail had gone cold and the estate returned to its routines. The handler would sometimes pause mid-task, struck by the sudden certainty that somewhere beyond the trees, the girl was still moving forward. Not hidden, not hunted, but simply present within a space that acknowledged her, while he and the others remained where they were, bound by fences and habits, and the quiet knowledge that they were no longer the ones who decided who was pursued and who was free, because the moment they released the dogs and followed the trail into that unmarked place, they had crossed into a story where they were no longer the hunters but the ones being observed, weighed, and silently judged by something that did not need to chase them to know exactly where they stood years later, when the estate had changed hands and the men who once ruled it were reduced to names spoken softly or not at all. The forest remained exactly as it had been. Trees grew thicker where paths had once been cut. The clearing was never found again, despite attempts by surveyors who swore the land had shifted beneath their measurements. Maps were redrawn, boundaries adjusted. Something unaccounted for remained, an absence shaped like certainty. The dogs never returned to the work they had been bred for. One grew old quickly, joints stiffening as if weighed down by memory. Another would not enter the woods at all, straining against its chain whenever the wind carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. The third died quietly one winter morning, eyes open, body calm, as though listening to something just beyond hearing. No one replaced them. No one suggested it. As for the girl, there were stories. They surfaced the way rumors always do, carried by travelers and traders who swore they had seen a woman walking alone, where no road should be, barefoot but unafraid, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew she would not be stopped. Some claimed she lived among people who did not ask where she came from. Others said she never stayed long anywhere, only passed through, leaving behind small changes that were noticed only after she was gone. No story agreed on details, but all agreed on one thing: no one ever tried to take her. Those who had joined the hunt aged differently than others. Their voices grew quieter. Their tempers dulled. When asked about that day, they spoke of weather and dogs and confusion. But their eyes betrayed them, always drifting toward the tree line as if expecting movement. Some drank more. Some prayed harder. None returned to the forest willingly. On certain evenings, when the air turned heavy and the light slanted just so, the land seemed to remember. Leaves would still. Birds would pause mid-call. And for a brief moment, it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, not in fear, but in recognition. The estate eventually fell into disuse, its buildings sagging, its fences collapsing inward, as though relieved to give up their purpose. Nature reclaimed what had never truly been owned. Roots split stone. Most swallowed names carved into wood. The ground softened, patient and thorough. And somewhere beyond what could be charted or claimed, beyond the reach of dogs and men, and old laws written in blood, a path remained open that did not show itself to those who hunted, only to those who ran not in terror, but in knowing, those who carried truth heavy enough to bend the world around them, those whom the land itself chose to let pass, leaving behind no trail, no echo, no ending that could be followed, only the quiet certainty that some stories conclude not with capture or death, but with release, and that once such a release has been witnessed, even indirectly, nothing that comes after can ever be quite the same again.